we have one more informational report that we're going to hear about this evening, and that is our second quarter school resource officer data and presentation. And Superintendent Kingsley, would you care to introduce this for us?
Sure. Members of the board and members of the community tonight, PSD Executive Director of Operations Matt Bryant and Assistant Superintendent of Secondary School Scott Nielsen will give us an update on the School Resource Officer Program. This update will include data, information on training, and an overview of what is next for our program. Matt and Scott, good evening. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Superintendent Kingsley and President Fev, Board of Directors.
Really? Do I look like Christoph to you?
Oh, God. I even. Oh, boy.
Hey, Scott.
Was the microphone on when I said?
Yeah, I think.
President Pedersen.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Oh, boy. That's a blast from the past, I guess. So we're here to do the second quarter SRO update, not the first quarter one. We did that one back when he was still here. We're looking forward to sharing tonight with some of the updates we have, some of the work that's ahead of us. As we get rolling tonight, and as I gather myself, we want to start with some definitions of some of the slides that you may see later on tonight. As you see throughout this, we talk about the SOPs. Those are standard operating procedures that we wrote about 18 months ago, 20 months ago. SROs are our school resource officers. FCPS refers to our Fort Collins Police Services. LCSO refers to our Larimer County Sheriff's Office. DHS, if you see that in there, refers to Department of Human Services. Calls/assists, they are a request for our SRO to intervene. And dispositions are the response that the law enforcement agency has to one of the calls/assists. So as that sets the groundwork, we wanted to refer back to this timeline that we talked about late last year when I think we came back in May and talked about what we would be doing going forward. And as you see here, we're in that second cycle, Steering Committee Winter Training Board of Education update. I also wanted to just go back and reiterate, when we shared this with the board in May, there were a couple things we talked about this oversight and training cycle. And we talked about the responsibility that the steering committee would have. And at the time we talked about the steering committee would focus on data, that we would share experiences, we would evaluate how things are going based on data, and based on the experiences that we're seeing from the school side, as well as from the police side. And that would guide the trainings we decide to put in place. We had a question, I think, from the board that we thought made sense for us to address in person tonight, and it has to do with how much have we shared the data that we're sharing with you tonight with other groups. And the fact of the matter is we have not shared what you're seeing tonight with other groups. But I do want the data that we're sharing, we will be putting in front of other groups as we have time with those individuals. But I also want to reiterate that in addition to what you're going to see tonight, focusing on our relationship with SROs, that the board will also be getting a lot of data over the next several months in our monitoring report that will include discipline data that we will be sharing with other groups as well. So we're working toward being transparent, but you are the first group that's seeing what we're seeing tonight. So I just wanted to be transparent about that as we move forward. As we shared this with you with a little less detail the first time we were together at the end of first quarter. So again, I just want to just briefly walk through the timeline for us to this point. We started with that July training where we had all the SROs, all of our principals, all of our assistant principals, and we closed the gap on what the standard operating procedures look like and what our expectations were. You can see on the bottom line that Matt and I have met with Larimer County Sheriff's Office multiple times as we've gone through the fall. And we did that because, if you recall, when we went through the process of landing the contract last year, we had a little more conversation with Larimer County Sheriff to make sure we had some congruent practices. We've had some meetings where we had to agree to disagree. And there was some energy in the room, and we've gotten to a really good place. So I just want to be transparent and say, as we've worked through the fall, we've gotten to a place where I think both sides are feeling more comfortable, understanding what's expected of each side, and how we're going to work together in a collaborative way, and they're seeing it out in the building. So that's worked out well. Again, that's the couple meetings that you see on August 10th, September 28th, and the December 10th meeting. Yes, we also met once in November. The other one I want to call your attention to that is new and different is when we met with our steering committee in November, the November 9th steering committee meeting. We invited all the normal individuals, including Timnath Police, Larimer County Sheriff's, Fort Collins Police Services, the district personnel, Dr. Guile, Matt, myself, Norm, but we also invited one of the district attorneys. And we did that because we wanted to try to understand what the role of our shifts. Remember, we made some shifts last year in how we were entering discipline into the system. We're doing some of the pass forward to get services directly from the school district. And we wanted to try to understand with law enforcement in the room, what impact is that having on the district attorney and the work they're doing. And for us, that guided the work that is our next step in our district, and it has to do with ongoing communication. It's not really about how we're operating with the police services and in the district. It's how we continue to communicate the continuum of services and support. And that came directly out of how do we continue to make sure individuals are in the loop and understand what needs students have and when those needs can be addressed and by who. So that was fascinating for us to align the police services with the district attorney and our needs at the forefront. It was a great conversation. I think it illuminated some of the work that's ahead for us. If you recall when we...
Just to be clear and maybe restate the obvious, when you say district attorney, you mean like the district attorney's office, not
Yes, yeah.
not Autumn.
Yeah. District attorney's office, yes.
That's what I thought. Okay, thank you.
Yep. If you recall, we talked about standard operating procedures. We wrote and implemented those about 18 months ago, maybe 19 months ago now. And we did that to deal with some of what you see in front of you. We had some disproportionate discipline data. Some of our disproportionate discipline data was in reference to our SROs being too involved for lots of reasons. In some cases, we were asking them to do things they didn't need to do. In some cases, they were overstepping. So they were getting involved for non-criminal offenses. And we had misperceptions about what we were trying to do in the system around restorative practices and diversion, and that those had to go through the police in order to do both of those. And over that, we saw some mission creep, and you heard those and saw those each time we've been in front of you, but we just wanted to make sure that we came back and talked to you, just reference those as we move forward. We believe some of the results that we're seeing as we've been back together now with law enforcement agencies multiple times this year, that we are seeing better collaboration. That our meetings with the SROs, we are closer together and closer aligned in some of the challenges they're seeing from the SROs, and we're hearing from our school side personnel. The meeting with the district attorney's office helped us discuss some of our internal processes. And there was support for those, but also a recognition of how do we make sure there's a continuity of communication. The data collection that we're seeing from Larimer County or from Fort Collins Police Services continues to be robust and is super helpful for us. And you'll see tonight, Larimer County Sheriff's starting to share us some results as well. And it shows, and you'll see, I think, as we go through tonight, that we see less law enforcement referrals, and in fact, quite a big drop. More student support that we have internally. We've also begun to see that the internal support that we're turning on through the family outreach, we're having families engage themselves to stay in touch with the family, with the Center for Family Outreach, and that's been a nice addition for our students. And then we continue to have the trainings, and our training for this round will happen next week. It was scheduled for early in January, but given the shifts we made in our administrative meetings, we moved it to the first meeting in February. So that'll happen next Tuesday as we talk about some of the communication between us and our SRO partners. With that, Matt's going to jump into some of the data.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. As my colleague, Dr. Lambert, pointed out, it's our pleasure to be here tonight. President Pedersen, that was for you. So I get the pleasure of reporting on the data that our law enforcement agencies report back to us and collect. And as Scott, referenced, it's pretty robust. I will try to do it justice as much as I can. I was chasing snowflakes at 2:30 this morning, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit. I'm trying. I don't drink coffee, so there's a reason for that. We can talk about that later. But anyway, so Fort Collins Police Service, they have a very robust system. Anytime that they make any kind of contact or student engagement, whether it's just a simple conversation or if it's stopping somebody in the parking lot, that may be using some bad judgment on driving behaviors, that all gets recorded and it becomes this data that you see in front of you now. So what I'd like to point out, some highlights here, is the first quarter, we had 559 calls and assists. You can see on the second quarter, you can see some of those lines have gone down, some have gone up, some have kind of stayed even. But the second quarter, we had 441 calls and assists, so we did have a decline in the total calls. To date, or to school year, we've had a total of 1,000 calls and assists that our SROs have responded to. I believe the last quarter when I came here, we had about 27 different categories on this chart. This time we've got 31. So the categories have increased just based on what types of responses and calls and assists they were called to, so they've added a couple there. Some of the ones that I would point out to you that are of areas that you may have heard in the previous presentation with mental health, you can see that's we have some assaults that have gone up, and I can go over some of those here in a few minutes and talk about that. You can see our harassment has gone up just a little bit. Our marijuana leaf calls have gone up, and I want to discuss the marijuana in a next chart here. And then our suicidal calls. So sadly, those have been increased, and we've heard multiple times tonight how important that is to our community, to our students. Some of those suicidal calls, many of those, if the SRO was called to assist with those, they made referrals back to the school and then entered the system with Ruben and his teams or our community partners. Those calls were made, they varied from staff, students reporting in, parents calling for help with their students, and then safe to tell reports as some of the ways that those are coming in. Some of the actions to those suicidal calls include mental health holds. And then references to our community partners. And later on at the end of this presentation, we'll show you some of those community partners that our SROs and our staff are working with to respond to this. One of them I do want to talk about standard response protocol. That one may kind of be wondering in your head, okay, what exactly is that? Those are our drills and our evacuations. So the SROs participate in those, and they offer guidance and evaluation on those. So that's what that standard report or standard response protocol is about. So our next slide here is our Fort Collins Police Services SRO dispositions. And as previously discussed, the dispositions is the actions taken. For our first quarter dispositions, we had 561. For our second quarter, there is 441 dispositions, again totaling 1,000. The blank that you see there is just a duplicate form or errors during submission. It doesn't mean that we lost track or anything like that. It just means that they had a duplicate there and getting out of that. One of the questions that was asked in the first quarter report was, what is the teaching? And we talked about what our SROs do in our schools and what they're asked to participate in outside of a law enforcement duty. But it kind of falls within their training and their specialty that they bring to our our sites. Some of that would be like internet safety training, threat assessment training, and drug and alcohol health classes, First or Fourth Amendment rights, things like that. So those are classes that they're brought in, and we talked about the process there where there is an opt-out when students or parents feel like they do not want to participate. We're still using that process as well when we go through that. The Fort Collins juvenile citation tickets. Okay. I thought it was hard to read there for a second, but I think it's okay. For the first quarter, you can see that it did go up by 8 as far as tickets go. One of the things we pointed out in the first quarter was that most of our tickets and our citations, all of them actually in that first quarter, related to victim crimes. So for victims' rights, those citations tickets were issued. For the second quarter, there was a change in the law for the amount of concentrate that a minor can have, which is basically 0, because of the effects that concentrate has and the danger of that. So that becomes an automatic first offense mandatory substance abuse program if you have concentrate for possession. So you'll see there about midway down where it says marijuana concentrate, there was 3 of those issued. So not necessarily a victim crime, but because of the law, our SROs are required to respond to that in there. Another question that came up in the first quarter from the board was, were we tracking IEP and 504 students? The answer to that is yes, and I can tell you that out of the 28 citations total that you see for the school year there so far, 4 of those were IEP and 504 students. And again, working closely with the school staff on the proper response there. But you can, unless there was the marijuana concentrate or leaf issue, you can assume that it may have been because of a victim was involved in that incident. The race and ethnicity information on the right-hand side kind of breaks that down. The SROs do not ask when they investigate or they react or respond to an incident. They don't ask for race or ethnicity. They don't assume anything. That information is taken from our Synergy system. So they look on there, and that's where we get our data for that. You can see there, one of the lines I'll point out is the Hispanic Latinx. There was 11 citations, tickets issued there. One of those incidents was multiple students. I believe there was 4 students involved in the same incident. So there was a big incident there. There was another couple incidents that involved 2 and 3 students at a time. So there was a couple of major incidents that increased that number. And then you can see that a total for the year is that 24, the information here, 24 out of the 28 citation or tickets issued were victim-related crimes. So the majority of these are still victim-related. Our felony filings, happy to report we're down a little bit there. So any kind of downward trend in that area is great to see, no matter how minor or major. So we will look to hold that hopefully. But you can see just the different kind of calls and assists that were responded to. And for the second quarter, there was 1 assault and 1 theft that resulted in a felony filing. And then again on the right, you can see it broken down by race and ethnicity by quarter. All felony filings are based on victim-related crimes. So the marijuana does not play into this report here. You would see a victim related on these. And then again, the race and ethnicity is from our Synergy system. So how were they notified? That was a question again that came up. You know, how are SROs knowing that they need to be involved or being called? So you can see the different categories here, the notification types. We talked a little bit about this the last time. You can see one of our bigger categories is still staff reported, which makes sense when you think about how many students are in our buildings and the contact hours that they have with our staff. and the vigilance there. So I don't think that's too shocking. One of the ones I wanted to talk about is dispatched. It's like, what is dispatched? I asked the question when I saw it. That is mean that somebody called 911. It was either during the day, it could have been off property, but somebody called 911, and the Fort Collins Police Services dispatch called an SRO because it did involve one of our students. That's a good thing, because our SROs are trained for our students. They are familiar with our students, and that means they're going to get treated a little differently, because that may ends up, instead of getting a ticket for something that another officer may not know, that they're a student at one of our schools, the SRO knows that, okay, we're going to go see the principal and we're going to work through this issue. So that helps us in our discipline reporting, or it helps us in our reactions and our incident actions that we take. So that is that good information there. You can see that most categories are down in that area about how they're reported. So I think you can relate that to just how many incidents that people are seeing and calling 911 for, or the safe to tell is down. We'd like to see those other categories that we mentioned earlier go down as well. Larimer County Sheriff's Office, the first quarter we didn't have any data, and I mentioned that we would bring data back this quarter, and this is the data that they have available to us. Larimer County Sheriff's Office is working closely with Fort Collins Police Services to bring like data to us as soon as they can. Fort Collins Police Service has made a significant investment in time and some money to get the reporting where they're at. Larimer County Sheriff's Office is trying to figure out how they can do that same, especially knowing that we're fixing to add another high school out in Wellington, and then Timnath will look at the same thing as we open that Timnath site as well for next year. We're hoping to see that all of our agencies are using some sort of similar or like program to record this data and report to it. But you can see there on the left, we talk about the summons that were issued is 3. We had 1 felony filing in our schools in the county, and then 2 restorative justice actions there. 21 SRO contacts or incidents, similar categories to the Fort Collins Police Services, not much difference there. And then our community engagement and events, again, those officers for the Sheriff's Office are highly involved in teaching when they're asked to, or when they have that opportunity, going to sporting events, making their presence known, learning and building those relationships with students at the same time, and doing some mentoring if they can. The SROs for the Larimer County Services does use a Google form, which does not collect race or gender or age. So as they develop that other program, hopefully they can pull that out of synergy, and we'll have that data for you as well. This data here is generally first semester data. It's not broken out by quarterly, so you're kind of almost seeing yearly data here. And they have committed to bringing us more accurate and descriptive data for a third quarter report, and we're going to help them as any way we can to help them do that as well, so that you can see that when we come back to you. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Lambert.
I deserve that. So as we get started on this tonight, we shared with you last time we were together that the majority of our discipline data would be part of our monitoring report when it comes out over the 2 reports later in the spring. But what we wanted to share tonight was data that is the pipeline, right? Is the connector between our work and the SROs, and that's when we formally refer to law enforcement. And what we decided to share with you tonight was we went back to our last full year, what we would consider kind of a normal year, and that's our 2018-2019 school year. And what that circle represents is a little over 7,200 major incidents across our district for the entire year. So I just want that in perspective. And for that year, 4.28% of the total majors were referred to law enforcement. In the current year, it represents through January 7th, so it's essentially half of a year. And up until a half of a year, we're a little under 1,900. So our number of majors is way down. But our referrals at 39 is only 2%. So our percentage of a lower number of majors is also down dramatically. So that's a celebration. I want to thank teachers, building leaders. That's all happening in buildings. And as we've worked to try to get back to what feels more normal in buildings, where students are building culture back in the buildings they're in, that's work. And it's our educators, our teachers, and our leaders out in the buildings that are making that happen, and our students that are stepping in the circle. And you saw in some of the data from Fort Collins Police Services that many of our data points are down. But in general, we're starting to see that just across the board, as we're seeing much more restorative type practices enter into the circle. And so as we think about some of the things that have helped us get here, clarity in the SOPs has made a huge difference. We have now SROs that we might ask a question who will say, that's yours. That's the school's to handle. We also might have a SRO that'll step in and say, hey, what can I do? And the school will say, that's ours. So the clarity both ways is helping to identify whose role, whose responsibility is it, and both sides taking ownership for that. So that's a big win for us. And restorative practices, no doubt, are having an impact, and particularly in the schools that are stepping into that with pretty robust practices. You're starting to see students buy in. But that takes some time, and it will continue to take time to see that pay dividends. But I would argue we're already seeing some of the dividends from that. And then some of the partners that have helped us as well, and we'll talk about some of those to end the presentation, have also been powerful in trying to see what we can do to intervene with students who are having some at-risk behaviors without starting them down that what some would say the school to prison pipeline. The second set of pie charts we wanted to share is the same data for our Hispanic students. And so in 2018, 2019, we had over 1,900 major referrals. 91 of them were referred to law enforcement. It was 4.7, and if you remember, the percentage on the other one was 4.28. So our Hispanics were a little overrepresented in the major, or in the yes category for refer to law enforcement. Not dramatically different, but overrepresented. If we take a look at this first half a year's data, we're looking at 660 total major referrals, or major incidents, with only 12 referrals to law enforcement and under 2%. The percentage back for everybody was 2.07. So the Hispanic is underrepresented in our current data, where it was overrepresented slightly in our last full year. So just a way to call out that for us to pay attention to how we're doing on our side. And we wanted to make sure that we did share this, what we believe is the conduit to the tickets, if you will, and it mimics pretty well. We've asked for 39, or we've referred to law enforcement 39 times, and I think there's been 32 tickets. So there's been a few of those cases where law enforcement has made a decision not to write a ticket, but in the majority of those cases, it's turned out to be victim-related, as Matt talked about, or in the case of those 4 cases, marijuana, and law enforcement has made a decision to write a ticket in those events. So our data is talking the same story, and that feels pretty good to us, and we think it's headed in the right direction. By no means are we there. By no means do we not have work ahead of us, but we feel pretty good about the progress we've made since we stepped into this process over the last 18 months. The last slide before we turn it over to conversation is we just wanted to put in the room tonight some resources that we feel like have been supportive to the district. This is this is definitely not all of the resources, but some we've used to help with some of the work this year. The Center for Family Outreach has been fantastic, and that is who we're using for our own diversion program for drug and alcohol support. And we're continuing to see success by many students who are stepping into that program. And even some of the students that have stepped into the program and not made it through have gone through some of the counseling, and we may end up seeing a benefit from that down the road. Even if they weren't completers at this time, they at least got some support along the way. But many of them are experiencing success as they go through it. And we've had great feedback from families. Students, the feedback is mixed, right? Because they've had to go to extra classes. But we've had several families that have asked the Center for Family Outreach, how do we stay in contact and how do we continue to use your services? And that's huge as we continue to move forward. Summit Stone continues to provide resources for our group. The Larimer County Hub is a great support system for students that we feel like might be at risk, for families where we might feel like the parents are abusive. And it's also an entry point if, in fact, a law enforcement needs a place because they have taken individual into custody. And we continue to promote Safe to Tell as a way to let us know what's going on. If by any stretch students don't feel safe, they don't feel safe about what's happening at their site, they don't feel safe about what's happening in their home. For whatever reason, there's something happening. Safe to Tell is a fantastic resource for them to utilize as well. So those are a few we wanted to put in the room that we continue to think help us as we move forward, and we'll continue to celebrate those as we come back with the board again at the end of third quarter. And with that, we would love to hear, as you had a chance to peruse this presentation even before tonight, what resonated with you as you see some of the progress that this presentation may demonstrate?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Would anybody on the board like to open the conversation? Kristen?
No, thanks so much. I'm telling you, what resonates with me is the fact that not only is the percentage down that gets referred, but the numbers overall are down, and that's fantastic. So I think it's really great to see that. I mean, the numbers are down by at least a third, it looks like. So I'm loving that. I do have a question. What happens to those students when they do get a ticket? So what at that point is PSD sort of hands off at that point, and it's all through the juvenile justice system, or can you just explain to me what happens when we've handed them off?
Yeah, so I'd like to say with our police services right now, we've worked out a warm handoff, as we talked about, as you heard Ruben talk about before. But one of the things we put in the SOPs was an encouragement to think about restorative practices or diversion. The majority of our students that they get a ticket for the first time, they end up in some type of diversion. And they're working real hard in that angle. Our restorative justice Fort Collins is fantastic. Many of those students that end up with tickets end up going through the restorative justice Fort Collins. So they have that same lens we do. Those students do that, though, with their first ticket. So, I mean, that ends up, they end up going through that process. But in general, that's if we were to talk to, if Fort Collins Police Services was here, a huge percentage of them go through diversion as a recommendation.
That's awesome to hear. And is it possible then, and it probably wouldn't be our stats then, but is it possible to get the stats of those who were ticketed the first time and completed and have finished and without having then a juvenile justice record? Is it possible to get that information?
Certainly is possible. We can get that data.
Yeah, because I think that would be truly helpful to see that is, even when they're being ticketed, that it is still restorative justice that's happening.
So let me just make sure I'm clear about the question, because there's maybe two pieces of data you're asking for that I see in my head. One would be the students who are ticketed
If they get,
and go
exactly.
through diversion. And I also heard in there a question for the students that we have gone through our own internal diversion and percentages that are success in that as well.
Absolutely. I'd love to see both.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Other reactions or comments or questions? DJ?
First of all, I want to thank you for taking on the challenge of being open and honest about this data and that we dive into it. I really do appreciate it. I really think that's the way that we can fix problems. And the pie charts, it is a great start. I'm excited to see those again in June, and so that we can see a year-to-year type of thing a little bit better. But it is a great first step. My wondering that I have for you is the assaults. And if, I guess first of all, if you could clarify that so that I understand correctly what is classified as an assault maybe would be good on that. But then my second question is there were comments that, there were some multiple people ticketed at a time. Is that also maybe why that number is up so high, is because it was multiply involved? I don't know how much we can.
Let me start, and then Matt can correct me. When we look at, we got some specific assault tickets, but when you look at the number of assaults that are in the report, they're large, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the assaults versus disorderly conduct, they switched. And if you recall our training, when we came and talked to you first quarter, our training was to define those two. So in some sense, the conversations or the information that law enforcement may have been handed was, we feel like this may be an assault. Assault, in terms of language, is often used like bullying when law enforcement is talked to. So in some cases, parents may have referred to and said, my son was assaulted. In some cases, we may have conferred with the law enforcement around what our perception was. Is this disorderly conduct or an assault? And so as they write that down, that may have been why that's on their assist conversation, because we asked for an assist or a collaboration, but not necessarily a ticket for that unless it broached that, right? In terms of the actual assaults that we have, they were all for fighting or fighting in the bathroom. Those kinds of things are what they were charged for. We had assaults that were students attacked and beat up another student. Multiple students attacked another student. So those things constitute an assault. Disorderly conduct is when Matt and I make a decision that we're going to go and we're going to fight, and we're both engaging in that. That's not me assaulting Matt or Matt assaulting me. That's considered disorderly conduct. So there are conversations that we may have with law enforcement around, does it constitute that? You can see what constitute that by what they've charged, not necessarily by what we've communicated or collaborated with them about as we're trying to make decisions how to respond in conversation. And that's what I think you see from the data that Fort Collins Police Services puts out, is they put out every conversation we're having is what goes on that chart. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily constitute that it's actually an assault, but that may be how the conversation starts. Does that answer the question, DJ? Or do I need Matt to fix my issue?
No, I that does kind of explain especially the types of calls and assists. I think that really brings that to light. And I think you got a roundabout that the assault really is, especially for the ones that are ticketed, it really is physical contact on a person.
For sure.
Okay. That's what I was.
And it's toward one other, it's toward another person that's not mutual consent.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions here in the room? Go ahead, Kristen.
I just have one quick one. The difference between teaching and mentoring. What is that?
Teaching is generally when we ask the SRO to go into a classroom and do teaching for the whole class. Mentoring might be informal. So they might step into a conversation with a student, and then the student might say, hey, how do I deal with X? And more of that one-on-one kind of conversation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Jess, do you have any questions or comments or reactions you'd like to share?
At the moment, I'm excited by the numbers I'm seeing, and I'll be really excited after another year of this, and hopefully what will be a more normal year, kind of see these trends continue. But thank you very much for this update.
Yeah, I'll add my thanks, and I do have one question, and that is that we talked about putting in place a mechanism by which students, staff, and SROs could comment on interactions between SROs and students in particular, but I suppose also with staff. Has that mechanism been put in place, and what kind of data do we have from that?
So yes, and that was asked at the first quarter meeting as well, and we told you we were developing that. That has since been developed, and we're meeting with communications on Friday to stand that up. I like that buzzword. Starting the 1st of February, and we'll have that available to students, staff. It'll be a QR code throughout the school where they can just click it. We're trying to make it as accessible as possible to anybody that wants to use that.
Okay, thanks for getting that in place. I really appreciate it.
Thanks to Madeline's team for doing the legwork on getting that process developed.
Thank you, Madeline. Superintendent Kingsley, you have anything you want to add to this? Okay. Okay, go ahead, DJ.
I had one other thing that I just wanted to thank you guys on, actually, is the incorporating the district attorney's office. I think that was a great idea and such a way to try to, bring it as a community-based look at it and looking at the student and helping them through their life a little bit. So I really appreciate taking the time to do that and stuff.
And along with those lines is when the SROs meet and they do their biweekly meetings, that the district attorney's office is involved in those meetings on that regular basis. So this was the first time the steering committee had an opportunity to interact with them and get some feedback both ways. But they are involved pretty on a consistent basis with SROs and student interactions.
Thank you for that information. Thanks.
And I'll just add my thanks again. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the data and for the progress we're making toward our values. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.